All right, so we are going to do something a little different today, and we're going to do some penciling and some coloring in one video. This is the cover to Annabelle issue 4. As you see here, I have my layout. So the layouts were done digitally, as I typically end up doing. It's just a better, quicker, easier process for me. It's easier to throw in some reference if I need to. I take that layout, print it out, and then I light table. And as you see here, we're getting into the pencils. I did a very loose, light penciled, light tabled of my layouts. When I come in here and do the pencils, I try to keep it loose. I try to keep it pretty light as far as pressing on the pencil. I don't go really dark with my pencils, at least in the initial stages. I've talked about in other videos where I do phases. I'll do typically 3 phases when I pencil something, and it just gives me the time to step back and try to check out any errors, check out any weird proportions that sometimes happen, and it just helps me to minimize those kind of oddities, I guess, in art. At least in my art, everyone's a little bit different, but you know with these loose light tabled layouts, I can go in here and start penciling a lot of the things. I do a quick light erase of all the loose pencils, and then this is really getting into phase 2 where I start looking at shapes and forms and proportions a lot better. I start really fleshing out the hair, the facial structure, like the shirt, like the material, how is it going to lie in certain areas, creases, wrinkles, things like that. I start thinking a little bit more of the material things that I'm working on, whether it's the skin, the shirt, the rocks, the fire, the scales. I mean, for this cover, there's a lot of different materials going on, and it's always helpful to be mindful of those materials. Again, this is just my process. This is really how I draw, how I tackle things, what I'm thinking about when I'm doing these things. Everybody kind of does things differently, and I know that a lot of artists, they've been doing it a lot more consistently and longer than I have. So for them, it's a lot easier to do this. For me, I draw, but I'm not drawing every day, unfortunately. But what I can do is when I am drawing, I can take the time to reference things that I need to reference, and with the material side of things, it sounds kind of odd to use that word materials, but everything is a material, whether it's metal, skin, fabric, whatever. Everything is there. So I just try to think about that. I also keep in mind here, I'm working on kind of background characters, and I want to make sure that I don't over detail those background characters. That's something that is really important when you're dealing with the planes of an image, your foreground, midground, background. Sometimes you have things in between those planes, but it's important to really try to focus on those 3 major planes. And for me, doing backgrounds typically will have less detail, and they will just have thinner lines even when I work on that. When I'm going in and doing the dragon here, I like kind of rougher looking pencils, or at least looser looking pencils. That gives me time to interpret when I do go in and ink my own work. So that was phase 2, and then I start rolling into phase 3 here, and this is basically, again, I do a light eraser. I have an eraser pad. It's like a drafting eraser pad or something. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a nice little eraser pad. You can find them anywhere. And what that does is that really helps it removes any light smudges, things like that. It also lightens up my pencils, and it gives me the ability, without really tearing up the paper, using an actual eraser. And here I'm really starting to focus on, since I know this is kind of my last phase in the penciling phase, I end up really thinking about all the detail. So I have all my forms, all the shapes are kind of pretty well established at this point. And, it gives me the opportunity to add in the folds, add in the wrinkles, add in the blacks, the shadows, any indication of a possible highlight, like rim lighting, things like that. Sometimes I'll go in and add in a line on the edge of a shirt or a skin or something like that to imply that there's a rim light there. Some artists do it, some don't. Again, this is just, how I tackle artwork and what I do, my thoughts on that. Going in and working on the face and really trying not to screw that up. There was, it was years ago, I came across, I think Dave Finch, it was talking about how he typically will start with the face, or how the face is the most important thing, generally speaking. So, don't screw that up. And I really took that to heart, and I try to like make the eyes at least be proportionate, the spacing, things like that. There's a lot that goes into, I think, artwork that a lot of just fans may or may not realize. There's a lot of thought that we as artists put into art. Sometimes that thought, you get from A to Z. The longer you do it, it's quicker to get from A to Z. It's quicker to get from, a layout to the final pencils. And some people don't do multiple phases like I do. For me, I kind of like to sit on the artwork for a little bit. I don't really like just do a layout and have finished pencils within one day. Typically, it's the course of a few days or several days where I'll sit and look at it and say like, okay, does this still look right? And there's a fine line between looking right and looking cool. And you know, I do artwork, I do, my books and things like that. A lot of it is about, for me personally, it's what I want to see. And I like cool artwork. It doesn't have to be proportionately correct. It can't look wonky. I mean, sometimes my artwork does look wonky and it's a little inconsistent. And I think that has to just do with the fact that I don't draw every day. And for me, it's about, superhero poses. It's about the cool factor. And that goes along with when I ink, when I'm inking, it's the same factor that I think about. It's the same thing. When I'm coloring, it's, is it exactly to the color theory and all those things I learned in college? Not necessarily, to be honest. A lot of it kind of bends or breaks rules, but at the end of the day, I want cool looking artwork, and for me, sometimes you got to know the rules to bend them, or break them. And, I think McFarlane even said that, and for me, it's kind of those things like, yes, I'm traditionally schooled in color theory and art and anatomy and all those things. But at the end of the day, like, how does that factor into doing comic art? There's so many styles out there. There's so many artists that just really push the boundaries of proportions and push the boundaries of just general character design. And for me, I kind of have this weird middle ground where I want it to look cool, but I also want it to be at least somewhat correct. And, if I can get 50-50 or 70-30, I'm going to be happy with that. And, for me, like working on this dragon here, I definitely did my research on dragons and, the history of dragons and things like that. And that's where Kerr really comes into play here. And, I like drawing scales and all the dragon stuff that goes into drawing dragons. It's a lot of fun. And this cover was a lot of fun to work on. But, kind of getting to the end of the pencil phase here, and we're going to be jumping into the colors in a little bit. But here you just see me, really working some of these details and things like that on the dragon. I didn't record me inking any of this, but as you can see, here's, the inked, and this is my flats. For those that, don't know what flats are, or, your base colors, I think is the other term I've heard people use. It's just a way to separate all the elements in a piece of art so that it's easier to select and color those individual pieces. For me, I do all my flats myself. Sometimes I do have, for sequential pages, I will, send it out to a flatter. And, because honestly, I don't have the time to do it myself. And kudos to those that do it, because it is extremely tedious. But for me, it's kind of like, for covers and pinups, I typically will spend an hour or two to do them myself. And, we kind of jump a little bit into, the whole coloring side of things. As I've mentioned in other videos, I have my Photoshop brushes. I have, kind of a way that I like to color and how I really approach coloring. you know, lights and darks and things like that. There's a lot of different styles out there, and honestly, I don't think any of them are really wrong. So, you know, my advice when talking to people at cons and just on social media and whatnot, if they ask for advice on coloring, it's like find something that you're comfortable with. You know, same thing with art. You know, find, you know, if you have your influences, I have definitely my influences, and sometimes it shows more than others, but find those influences and work off of that. You know, find, if you're a colorist, find, you know, there's a lot of colorists that I look up to professionally, and, you know, I look at how they color something, how they approach coloring, and, you know, I try to integrate that into what I do. Definitely not like the fastest guy out there. I don't do a lot of the cut and gradient styles. I've done that on a couple indie projects that I've worked on, and although I've been told it looks good and people like it, it's just one of those styles I never really got really comfortable with to where that's my go-to style. I like this kind of more, I don't know if you want to call it painterly style. It's kind of a mix of like airbrush and some harder cut edge lines. And then I will go in if need be and do some cut and gradients. I typically work with layer masks to kind of feather out some of those some cut and gradient styles. Here you see I'm working on the face, and you know, it's really important for certain elements that you got to spend the time to get them right. And a face is definitely to me one of those things. I don't probably always hit the mark on it, but I think generally speaking, I probably spend more time doing faces and hair than I do probably any other part of a piece, because those to me seem to be a lot of the standout parts of a piece. Skin tones are pretty important too, and you know, bouncing back and forth with her skin tone, trying to get that right. When I also do a piece, I will always have this extra layer for brightness and contrast, and that's just, again, that's another thing that I do, because I've noticed over the years that sometimes I end up going a little too dark because, you know, I end up having my monitor set. I have all these things, kind of parameters that I work within, and it just, the piece ends up a tick dark. And also, you know, having the years that I've worked in a printing press kind of industry, when you print, things typically will roll about 10 to 12% darker. So I use this brightness and contrast layer, and I kind of have my numbers that I default to, and then I can just kind of tweak it here or there depending on the piece. But, you know, typically I'll bump up the brightness at least 10 or 15% in the contrast. And what the contrast kind of does for me, at least, it helps to really kind of separate the colors a little bit better. So where it does make the darks a little darker and the brights a little brighter, but by doing that, it also creates like a nice visual separation of the colors and things like that. So I like using a brightness and contrast. You can see in my layers here, it's not active right now. I don't actively keep it on when I'm coloring. It's there for me to do kind of at the end, where it's like, hey, how does this piece look? Bump up the brightness and contrast. There's a layer mask there, so I can, you know, take out any areas that are too bright or any areas that are kind of getting too dark. And if need be, I will go in and select individual pieces and kind of work on those at the end. I try to keep a focus on like the whole piece as a whole. Like the what does it look like all together? Again, keeping your planes in mind, foreground, midground, background. You know, I have this kind of this color palette that I've established over the years of working on Ice Pick and Annabelle, and that's what I'm using here. And you know, Ice Pick doesn't show his costume in this issue, but you know, I thought it'd be fun for fans because really, you know, all the characters in Annabelle, their first appearance was in Ice Pick. But here's the final piece. I start adding in some of the highlights, some of the contrast a little bit. I start adding in some of the magic and those effects, the fire effects and things like that, lens flares, all that fun stuff. And then, you know, this is what the cover ended up looking like at the end. So hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you at the next video.